probably heard of the 30% housing rule, but here's the problem. It rarely reflects today's market. A new bank rate analysis found that a typical U.S. household would need to spend about 43% of their annual income to afford a medium-priced home.
Ahce was a genius.
Is the 30% rule still realistic in today's economy? I would say yes and no. For the average earner, absolutely not, because the prices keep going up, but the wages don't necessarily match the prices being presented to us in today's economy. But I also say yes because if you make a certain amount of money, the 30% rule still works. So the problem isn't really the rule, it's the wages. The wages don't make sense when you do the math. But let's get into all of that, man.
One of the old financial rules that people are expected to follow from the past is that you should never spend more than 30% of your income on housing. And the funny thing is, that's twofold, right? There's two problems with that. Number one, they're talking about 30% of your gross income, right? So your net income is actually smaller than your gross income because net is what you receive after paying Social Security and taxes and things like that. But the rule of thumb has always been for the longest time not to spend more than 30% of your gross income on housing. But right now, the typical American household would need to spend 43% of their income just to be able to buy the median price home. So that's a pretty big departure from the 30% rule. And keep in mind, we're also talking about gross income here. So assuming the average person, pays about 20% of their income in taxes, that means people are actually having to spend closer to 60% of their take-home pay on a mortgage payment right now to be able to afford a house. And this is the fundamental reason why the housing market is at a standstill. And a lot of people have to make a hard choice between owning a home and financial stability. But a lot of times that choice is made for them because if you were to go and qualify for a mortgage, you would not be approved. If you need to spend 45% of your income on the mortgage payment, chances are you're not going to be getting that loan unless it's an FHA or a VA loan. Then you might have a chance of getting approved. But for a conventional loan, probably not, guys. Maybe if your assets and your credit are very strong and you can put a very strong down payment, maybe like 30%, maybe you could get it, maybe you could swing it, but most likely no. And the crazy thing is that 30% is supposed to cover your property taxes, your homeowner's insurance, your HOA fees, if any, and all of the hidden costs that show up once you own the home. So I don't know at what point in American history Americans were only spending 30% of their income on their mortgage payment, but I would wager to say that you would have to go pretty far back in the past to find a time when that was a feasible thing to do. And in the most expensive cities across America, places like Miami, where I'm at here, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, people have to spend upwards of 65% of their income to be able to afford a mortgage payment. So that's obviously not going to happen. And there's really only a few places in the entire country where you can actually still abide by this rule of thumb and make it work, guys. Places like Pittsburgh, Detroit, and St. Louis are basically the only three major metros in the country where you can actually still do this. But if you live anywhere in the country besides those three cities, this is impossible and you will need to spend more than 30% of your income on a payment. And this is all because home prices have gone up about 50% since 2020, while wages have only gone up about 22 or 23%. So literally the math doesn't add up anymore. It doesn't work. The typical household today would need to earn about $113,000 per year in order to be able to afford a home, whereas back in 2020, it was only $78,000 a year. So the income gap has completely exploded just in the last 5 years. And that's why, like it or not, you're probably not going to be able to stick to this old 30% rule. In fact, I think we have to just throw it completely out the window, guys. Like, you have to resign yourself to the fact that if you want to become a homeowner in 2026, you're going to be dedicating a more sizable portion of your income to your payment, and you need to be comfortable with that. Well, how do you get comfortable with that? by doing the things I talk about here on the channel, by making sure you have saved for a down payment, making sure you have an emergency fund that can stretch you for 6 to 12 months without having work. Make sure that you are mentally and financially prepared to take on the responsibility of being the landlord, because now you are one, even if it's just for yourself. And everybody also needs to kind of figure out what they feel comfortable with. Just because you can get approved for a mortgage of any amount doesn't mean that you should take it. Like a higher income household, for example, if you're spending 40% of your income on a payment, that might be okay if you still have plenty of money left over for savings and emergencies and other necessities that you have to pay for. And of course, the higher your income is, the more likely you're going to be able to put more of that money aside for other things, versus when you have a lower income, that's just not possible. Because when you're lower income, once you go above 30 or 35% of your monthly income for your house payment, well, now all of a sudden doesn't leave you a whole lot of cash left over. Like, for example, you got somebody making $100,000 a year, well, that leaves them still $60,000 left over, versus if you're only making 50, that only leaves you an extra $30,000 left over for the year, and that's it. But yet it is becoming routine for people to actually be spending well over 50% of their take-home pay on their house right now, because let's say they go to get approved for a mortgage and they get approved to spend, let's say, 35% of their income. Still pretty close to the 30% rule, right? But that only takes into consideration your actual monthly mortgage payment. It doesn't take into consideration all the extra expenses that homeowners have, which even Zillow confirms is well over an extra 20 grand a year. And mortgage brokers don't take that into consideration either when they approve you for the loan. So you can see how those expenses quickly add up. And since the math just doesn't work for so many people, buyers are forced into the situation of they have to wait till much later in life to buy. They have to move further away from their desirable area in order to buy. They have to downsize. They have to compromise on the home itself. They have to stay in the home much longer in order to justify the upfront costs, or they just have to remain renters for life. And it still remains a fact that renting is cheaper by 50 to 100% per month, basically everywhere across the United States right now, except for those few metros that we mentioned: Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and Detroit. Unless you want to live in one of those three places, buying probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, at least from a financial standpoint and a monthly payment standpoint. Of course, there are other reasons to buy that we're not talking about right now. We're talking about just a monthly payment perspective. Now, the idea moving forward is, even though the 30% rule might not be realistic anymore, you should try to at least aim to remain as close to that figure as possible, because it was a good rule of thumb, but the problem is it's just not realistic anymore. There's almost a 100% chance that if you're jumping from being a renter right now into being a homeowner, you are going to see a major increase in your monthly payment, guys. Like, if you're one of the lucky ones and your monthly payment is remaining close to the same, or maybe even going down, it's cheaper to buy in your area than to rent, rest assured there are going to be other expenses that you're going to encounter that are going to change that equation over time. This doesn't mean nobody should buy. It just means be ready for that. And by the way, anybody who wants to buy or sell anywhere in the United States, if you need a real estate agent, I can set you up with one 100% for free. All you have to do is use the link down in the...
Oh man, this is very interesting, man. The 30% rule is not realistic anymore. But like I said, the problem isn't really the rule. It's the fact that the money that we make now doesn't work with the rule. Like, if you make a certain amount of money, the rule still works. The problem is we don't make enough money. You know what I'm saying? So, like I always say, one of the best things you can do is find ways to make more money. Because if you can add another 25,000 or 50,000 to your income, it'll do a lot for you. And also, like I said before, we need to be comfortable working together. Like, in this economy, we need each other. You know what I'm saying? This ain't the economy to be, I got this, I'm gonna do it all by my, like, unless you really got it like that, this is not that type of economy, man.
Andrew, I want to buy a house. What percent of my monthly salary should go towards my mortgage payment? The age-old question. That's an easy one. 30%. Why? Because staying under 30%, it leaves room in your budget for savings, emergencies, date night, all the other stuff that life throws at you. But here's the thing. That rule was made decades ago. And with today's prices, some experts feel 30% is just not realistic. They're saying the new benchmark is like 40% to keep up with the Joneses or the new housing crisis. So what do? You start at 30% and then adjust it from there if needed. And if you don't care about some dumb rule and just want to know how much you can actually afford, I made an affordability calculator that you can use anytime. So comment rule and I'll send it right over.
So as you can see, what they're saying is like, no, the 30% rule isn't really realistic anymore. But if you can stay around that area, you definitely should. So like I said, it's not the rule, it's the wages. So instead of addressing the real issue, which is we don't make the money that we should be making, we're now readjusting our lives to what we do make. I mean, what else could we do? You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't force a job to pay you more. You can't, but you can, you know, learn new skills and increase your income, which is why I always say, just find ways to make more money. It's easier to make more money than to do a lot of these other things.
Not supposed to spend more than 30% of your gross income on housing. This has been financial advice for many, many decades, and it is very smart, but unfortunately it's not feasible for the average American anymore, depending on where you live, because the median household income sits around $85,000. So 30% of that gross income would be $2,125. So your home price would have to be around $270,000 with a 5% down payment. So depending on where you live, that might not be available. And to be honest, for most Americans, $270,000 is kind of off the table because the median house price in this country is now $400,000. So using this method of 30% gross, you would have to earn $125,000 to be deemed financially responsible and not be worried about being house poor. But again, how many American families make over $125,000? It's a very low percentage. And if you want to look at renters, this also applies to rent, but that has changed because the average salary sits around $55,000, $60,000. So you really shouldn't be spending more than around $1,400, $1,500 on rent, where again, in most metropolitan areas, that's very difficult to do unless you're splitting the apartment.
Very true. It is very hard. It's hard. It's getting very hard to find rent for like $1,400. You know what I'm saying? $1,500. Like, they pushing it now. They're pushing it, bro. Like, I'm talking $1,800, $1,900, $2,000. Like, they're pushing it. Like I mentioned, I was looking at a place 6 months ago that was like $1,500, $1,600. That same place 6 months later is $2,000. In 6 months, they have increased the rent by $400 to $500, bro. That is insane. That is insane. Like, that's a big difference. Like, going from paying $1,500 to paying $2,000, yeah, that's a big difference. Big difference.
If you've budgeted for rent or applied for a mortgage, you might have heard of the 30% rule. It's this idea that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your pre-tax yearly income or annual salary without deductions on housing. But where did this number come from? And is it still relevant? In the US during the late 1960s, Congress capped rent in public housing to 25% of a tenant's income. Then it was changed to 30% in the 80s. Many countries followed suit, sticking to that number when budgeting for rent and home ownership. Financial advisors still use this guideline today. Before you buy a house, mortgage providers will want your housing costs to be less than 35% of your total pre-tax income. That's known as the mortgage stress test. But the 30% rule was only supposed to be used for rent in public housing. Now we're using it to budget for mortgages and rent in general, which is a tall order in this economy. That's because it doesn't account for rising home prices and stagnant incomes. Some financial experts are suggesting people ditch it.
That 30% number is really difficult in today's economy.
Take the average renter rent for an apartment in Vancouver. It's going for this. And those prices are rising everywhere across Canada, more than $100 a month right now. If you were living alone in Vancouver, you would need to earn at least $11,000 a month to be able to pay for that rental and still keep your housing budget under the 30% guideline. That's nearly impossible for most people in Canada. Just look at the average income. So here's what this expert suggests you can do instead.
Look at all of your spending and find out where the pressure points are and where there may be room to change things around and to find some extra cash.
She suggests tracking your spending for a few months before you draft a budget. That'll help you understand where your money's going.
It just may be in these times when prices really are increasing, making some compromises, and that may be living in a roommate situation.
Obviously, it's important to save money if you can. This financial advisor says following the 30% guideline could help you save.
It may not be an applicable rule for a lot of people, but I think it's still a good aspirational rule because it allows them to do all of the other things in their life.
Do you have any questions about budgeting for rent or the housing crisis? Let us know in the comments.
Like I said, I really feel it's a good rule, but it's just not realistic anymore. See what I'm saying? Like, the rule isn't broken. If you can abide by that rule, then you're good. I'm doing a video, man. Like, yeah, if you can abide by that rule, you'll be all right.
Probably heard of the 30% housing rule, but here's the problem. It rarely reflects today's market. A new bank rate analysis found that a typical US household would need to spend about 43% of their annual income to afford a medium-priced home. This is a national average, but even in different pockets of the country, we're increasingly seeing more Americans who are willing to go past the 30% rule so that they can get their piece of the American dream. Out of the 34 largest US metros, only about 3 still meet that traditional 30% benchmark for the typical household: St. Louis, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. Coastal cities like New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, a typical household would need to spend 2/3 or more of their income to afford the median home. More affordable markets like Charlotte, Atlanta, and Houston are closer to 40%. Housing experts suggest looking at the 30% rule as a loose affordability guideline, especially since the definition of affordability varies by income. For lower and middle income households, that benchmark matters a lot more because there's less wiggle room in their budgets. Higher income households have more discretionary spending, and there's a higher chance that going over 30% may not create the same financial strain. That's why experts stress that every buyer situation is different. Savings, spending, lifestyle, those all play a role. Most agree that once housing costs approach 50% of your gross income, that's a major red flag. The dream of owning a home, even if it costs more, doesn't seem to be going away. So the real question, are you willing to spend more than 30% of your income on housing to be a homeowner? Comment and let's talk about it.
That's what I want to know. Like, is the house worth it or the extra cash? See what I'm saying? Like, would you rather have the house or the freedom with your money? You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, do I want to buy this house or do I want to have money to invest and save? Like, because it's seeming like if you get the house, your funds are going to be very limited. If you just do the math, you're not going to have that much extra cash. We talking about you sacrificing vacations, whatever, you know what I'm saying? A lot of things are gonna have to be reconsidered if you get the house. If you can't stay below that 30% or close to it, like if you get to the point where you spending 50%, 50 to 60%, you know what I'm saying, of your gross income on housing, is like, what are we doing? You still got so many other bills that you got to worry about. And then when you own a house, anything go wrong, it's on you. So you really need money for, like, you need a just in case. You know what I'm saying? You need just in case money. I don't know, man.
Spend no more than 30% of your pay on rent. In this economy, that rule has been around for generations, but is it realistic today? The adage is based on old studies of 19th century working class families, which found that people tended to spend about a week's wages on 1 month's rent. Chris Herbert, managing director for Harvard's Joint Center on Housing Studies.
That led to this rule of thumb that said you shouldn't spend more than a quarter of your income, basically, on housing, because if you spent more than that, you wouldn't have enough left over for everything else.
Fast forward a few decades, and the federal government used that same guideline, 25% of wages, when developing housing assistance programs. And in the 1980s, Congress raised that to 30% to cut back on federal spending. Today, the guideline is tough for many people to meet.
And so if I'm very poor and I'm making very little amount of money, then spending even a third of my income or 30% of my income on housing might mean I don't have enough left over for food or everything else.
Renters in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles are stretched thin too, said Daryl Fairweather, chief economist at Redfin.
If you're also moving to a really high cost of living city and you want to jumpstart your career in a place where job opportunities are growing, you might end up having to spend more than you feel comfortable with just so that you can get your career on the right track.
On the other side of the spectrum, very wealthy people are unlikely to find this rule useful, since after a point, no rental would come close to 30% of their income.
So if I'm Jeff Bezos, I could probably spend 99.9% of my income on housing and still have enough left over for everything else.
So what if you're not a billionaire like Jeff Bezos? First, look at your current expenses and do the math.
Figure out how much they're currently spending on their necessities, groceries, transportation costs, healthcare costs, making sure they have enough money for emergency savings and for retirement savings. And then whatever money is left over is essentially how much you can spend on housing.
Kimberly Palmer, a personal finance expert at NerdWallet, suggested the 50-30-20 method to us. Try to spend 50% of your income on needs, including rent, food, and transportation. 30% should be spent on wants, and the remaining 20% should go towards savings. With that in mind, you might end up having to make concessions like finding roommates, staying with family, or living near public transportation to ditch a car. But however you budget, make sure to leave wiggle room on rent, since housing costs tend to rise over time. For PBS News, I'm Hannah Grabenstein.
Shout out to her. Hey man, it's looking like what it's really looking like. It all comes down to budgeting your money, all right? So you have to be aware of your finances. And this is the journey that I went on recently where I had to really sit down and write down everything, right? I had to know where every dollar was going. And you don't realize until you do it how helpful it is. Like once you realize, okay, I'm overspending in this area, I'm spending too, you know what I'm saying? Like once you know where your money is going, it changes how you look at your situation. You like, wait, I can do this, or I could cut back here and it's gonna improve, you know what I'm saying? So yes, the 30% rule is not realistic in today's economy, but you should try to achieve that if you can. But like I said, you also will probably be making tough decisions. You also will probably have to choose between having extra loose cash and having a home, because unless you make a certain amount of money, it's just tight out here, man. It's tight out here. It's tight, it's tough. It don't seem to be getting better. It don't seem like anyone cares to make things better for the average person. I always feel like things are in my control, as far as I can't sit around and count on people to make decisions that's gonna better my life. It's on me. I gotta do things in order to put myself in position to live, you know what I'm saying? But what do y'all think, man? Should we abandon the 30% rule? That's the real question. Should we abandon the rule? I don't think we should abandon it, but it definitely doesn't make sense no more. But man, until next time, Ahce will gone.